Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this webinar today offered by the Beverly Hills Bar Association. Is my workplace safe? Returning to the workplace mindfully. My name is Jeffrey Bills. I'm an attorney with the Kick Law Firm. I'm a member of the Beverly Hills Bar Association Labor and Employment Law section and on the Board of Governors. And I'm so happy today to have Leslie Wallace with us to present on this important topic. I will note beforehand that the materials were sent to everyone. The program materials were sent to everyone by email with a link if you're looking for them. And it's also posted, I believe, in the chat now. And in about 24 hours from now, the MCLE certificates will be sent via email to those of you who are here today with us. So I'd like to introduce Leslie, who many of you may have seen in previous presentations. Leslie Wallace is a shareholder in Ogletree Deacons. She's an employment attorney in Los Angeles. In addition to advising employers about a wide range of employment-related matters and performing workplace investigations, Leslie provides training primarily in the areas of harassment, discrimination, and diversity. Prior to beginning her legal career, Leslie studied with the Royal Ballet in London, England, and then had a career as a ballet dancer in the US and abroad. In 2016, Leslie completed the UCLA's year-long.
That's okay. I will jump in and complete that. He was about to say that I finished the year-long program at UCLA for facilitating mindfulness. And I think we will jump right in then at this point. So I'm going to share my screen and let's jump in. And I did want to mention that you can type into the chat at any time, and we will, hopefully Jeff will be monitoring it. I will try to do so as well. Okay. So the agenda for today is we're going to talk for a little bit about what safety is. What is the reopening status currently in California? What are the risks and requirements of reopening a business here? What legal tools do you have for addressing these risks and requirements? We're going to talk for a while about vaccinations because I know it's a really hot topic. What about employees who refuse to return to work? A little bit about remote work and some thoughts about what to do about that. And then finally, the best practices for reopening while mindfully fostering inclusion of your employees, those of your clients, and so on. So the first question we have here is, what is safety? So what does it look like? Safety is a state in which hazards, this is more of a dictionary definition, hazards and conditions leading to physical, psychological, or material harm are controlled in order to preserve the health and well-being of individuals and the community. So notice it is not a state in which there are no hazards or conditions that could potentially cause harm. It's if those conditions are controlled. It is an essential resource for people to feel that they belong to the community, whatever that community is defined as. So to reach the optimum level of safety in any kind of setting requires that the individuals, the communities, employers, employees create a climate of social cohesion and peace and equity. To the prevention and control, again, you can't stop it all, but we're trying to control injuries and other consequences of harm that are caused by accidents or incidents. Respect and for values of the physical, material, and psychological integrity of individuals, and the provision of effective preventive control and rehabilitation measures. Safety requires process. It is not a single, fixed thing. And initiatives that focus on the environment that you and or the people you work with find yourself in, and on behavior that is going to impact that. So how can you get there? Well, the first thing you need to do is conduct a hazard analysis. Now, from a physical perspective, that looks like, you look through, is there, what we usually think about in terms of safety and accidents is, am I going to trip on something? Is there space? That kind of thing. We are looking at that in terms of the COVID return to work. We are also looking at a hazard analysis from an emotional perspective. Determine what the control points are. What can your business, your client's business, what can you as an individual in the workplace or the community control? You don't have control over all of it, but see where you do have control and where you don't. What are the limits to whatever your workplace community is going to tolerate in terms of deciding what you're going to do? And how are you going to monitor those things? Then if you find that you're not reaching those goals, those limits, the analysis has shown you that there are hazards, how are you going to correct the plan if it's not working? And verify that in fact the plan is working. So whatever it is that you decide to do, don't just make a plan and just assume it is automatically going to work, or that there won't be any changes needed. And then finally document or record or have some means of looking at what is working, what is not, and verifying not only from look-see, but something that shows so somebody else could pick up the pieces about what you've tried. So here is sort of a guideline about what safe reopening is likely going to look like, the best practices, which we'll talk about again at the end, which is ensuring a safe workplace and noting, of course, that what is safe is a pretty complex thing to look at. Determine whether and which positions in any organization need to return to the office, can continue to work remotely, or can work partially remotely. So it's not an all or nothing, and that is one of the lessons of the last little bit of time. Develop a realistic timeline. We do have a tendency to think, okay, let's go, let's flip the switch. And instead, we may be looking at more of a slow entry. Develop a remote work plan agreement for those who are or may continue to work that way. Provide guidance for any managers within your organization, again, and or for clients, and be prepared to be flexible and mindful while you're doing it. You also want to share concerns. You want to be as transparent as possible. Share commitments. This is what the expectations are, and this is what I am committed to doing. Be open to some experiments. You're going to try things, and some of them won't work. Examine the reasons for your workplace plans. Why am I doing this? Or why is my organization doing this? Or do they have a reason for doing this? And then listen to concerns, really listening as those concerns arise. So let's talk for a minute about the physical safety aspect and what is mandated now in California for California businesses. Right now, based on what the governor has said, and of course, again, we're at April 28th, so things could change before June 15th. But right now, the California is supposed to fully open. What that means is that it will move beyond the tier system that we currently have in place with the purple, red, orange, and yellow, and won't have tiers anymore if these two criteria are met by June 15th. That there has been equitable vaccine availability, which so far looks like we're heading in that direction, and hospitalizations are and remain stable and low as they are now. The governor has also said that we will have common sense health measures. Masking will continue and remain across the state. I am aware that the CDC has just come out with guidance that if somebody is fully vaccinated, they may not need to use a mask, at least outside, but that is not yet the requirement here in California, nor has the governor said he's going to head that way. We'll see. Testing or vaccine verification requirements will likely remain as well, in addition to having to have operations that are in compliance with the emergency temporary standards of Cal OSHA. And I'll talk in another slide a little bit more about what those requirements are. And workplaces are supposed to be promoting policies reducing risk. That includes monitoring, checking your indoor ventilation system, that mask wearing will be required indoors and in high-risk settings. And that when there still is remote work available, I think the state is actually hoping that that will continue, at least in part, as long as it doesn't impact business operations. And of course, the longer we have worked remotely, the harder it is to make the argument that this is that remote work is a significant negative impact. We also have the emotional and psychological safety for California businesses that we want to look at. So we're looking at the legal implications of not paying attention to these things. A lot of people are coming back to work or starting to come back to work, and they're still really concerned. The statistics around mental health issues related to COVID are staggering, and we can't simply ignore them. There may be retention goals. So how do you want to reopen, and how do you want to make sure that you keep the people that you want to keep? Being aware of the impact of their current status, the impact of trauma that pretty much everyone has experienced during this pandemic and during the last year with regard to a number of other issues that have come up. We have to be very cognizant of our obligations to accommodate mental health concerns. And then finally, looking at whether mindfulness can help develop this workplace safety. What does that look like? So what is mindfully returning to work, which is what the subheading of this look like? Well, let's talk about what mindfulness is. It's a term that gets floated a lot lately, and it means different things to different people. There are many different definitions. I'm going to provide two here. But think about when you use the term, what it is you mean by it, and make sure that that gets defined. So one definition is simply the quality or state of being conscious or aware of something. The second one is a little bit more nuanced, which is the art of observing your physical, emotional, and mental experiences with deliberate, open, and curious attention. Now you'll see that these are actually fairly different because one is simply being aware and the other has more of an active quality of being curious and open. Mindfulness can be a really helpful tool in skilled hands. What can it help you do? It can help you find balance. It can help reduce stressors and suffering in your own life and those maybe of the people around you, because as you are more balanced, it will impact them. And it allows, very importantly during this time, both from a societal perspective, from the pandemic perspective, from a look at the social justice aspects of what's going on in the country specifically right now, to be with others suffering without losing yourself in it. It can also help people connect and, or in this case, maybe reconnect, and you can practice it anywhere. And I want to put a little bit of an asterisk on this because mindfulness, I love the practice. I am an advocate, but I also do know that in unskilled hands, there are ways that it can trigger folks. And just be cautious. I am not a therapist. I'm not going to pretend to be one. And if you're using it as some form of therapy for your employees, coworkers, colleagues, be cautious about that unless you yourself are a therapist, because there can be triggering effects. All right, so let's look at the reopening status right now for where we are in LA County. We are currently in the orange tier. And what that means is that offices are permitted to reopen. Some people have been open throughout. Legal services has been considered an essential service, but most people have had at least some portion, if not all, of their employees working remotely. But there are modifications, and telework still must be encouraged, meaning if people can work remotely, they should be encouraged to do so. That is even true in the yellow tier, which is the minimal tier. So not until we're out of the tier system are we supposed to require folks to come back in, because we are supposed to be encouraging them to work remotely. If you want to look at the LA County protocols for office work sites, you can find them in the Appendix D to those protocols, and there are a lot of box checks about, telling people that they should remain home if they can. There are 5 key areas to be addressed when you're developing reopening protocols, which are supporting and protecting employees and customer, client, vendor health, ensuring appropriate physical distancing, which is going to continue, proper infection control, so making sure still that there is hand sanitizer, places to wash, that people are really thinking about what did we have to do at the beginning of this pandemic when we very first started and we didn't know what was happening, and are being careful not to abandon all of that. Communicating with the public and ensuring equitable access to various services. So I said I was going to speak a little bit more about the emergency temporary standards. These were adopted at the end of November of last year by Cal OSHA. They remain applicable regulation. They were adopted for 180 days with a likely extension of 180 days. They require that all businesses have a COVID prevention plan, much like your illness and injury and illness prevention plan. It has 11 elements in it, including training and ventilation and inviting input from people in your particular organization. There are not any changes to these that are anticipated in the next 90 days. We expect they will remain in place through at least November of 2021. There is some talk about extending these further, maybe with some changes as vaccines become more prominent. But important to note that these emergency temporary standards have not adjusted for vaccinations. So all of the rules that apply with regard to them remain currently. This may change, but right now, if there's an exposure in the workplace, regardless of whether someone is vaccinated or not, they will need to be excluded from the workplace. And of course, if they can work remotely, they can continue to do that. If they can't, then there would be an obligation to, a potential obligation to pay them for the time if they are exposed in the workplace. If not, they need to be excluded and would not need to be compensated.
Leslie, may I interject a question about this?
Sure.
If people are going to be returning to an actual workplace setting and they haven't been in the workplace for quite some time, should they be looking for these IIPP plans or the COVID prevention plans to be posted somewhere in particular that they could review?
They don't have to be posted in a particular place, but they do need to be made available to employees, and you are supposed to make them aware of everything that would be in them, essentially, through the training requirements. And there's a number of elements of what you need to include in the training, which includes things like the benefits that are available to them. So everybody needs to be made aware of that. You can probably do the training in 20 minutes or so. I also wanted to let you know that the CPP plan template, there is one on the Cal OSHA website. It's very legalistic, but for lawyers, that probably is not a problem. It is a form that you can use, and the Cal OSHA inspectors like it because they're familiar with it. So they can just check the box and say, oh, you did everything that we need you to do, and we can move on to the next inspection. So that would be a place to find one and make sure that you have it in place before you reopen. All right, so let's look at the risks and the requirements that are associated with reopening. So as I just mentioned, there's the CPP, the COVID prevention plan. So make sure that you're including all the categories. Again, go look at the template on the Cal OSHA website. Easy to find if you just Google Cal OSHA. But also make sure that you're revisiting the plan regularly, because as things change, as our guidance changes, the plan may need to change. You're going to have to give timely notice under the various statutes that we have in place in California, AB 685, that requires notification if somebody does become ill and there has been exposure to everybody in the workplace. They will all need to get, if there's been someone in the work site who ends up having COVID. There are reporting requirements. I'm not going to get into all the details on what needs to be reported where, because we would never get through the material. You will need to have some way of doing contact tracing for your own employees to see who's been in close contact. You need to be, again, familiar with the exclusion pay rules under the emergency temporary standards. And finally, and maybe most relevant for most people, is the California supplemental paid sick leave requirements. I'm going to go into those a bit more depth. I also wanted to make you aware that just a few weeks ago, I think it was, I want to say March 12th, but I know it was mid-March, a case came down called Sargent versus the Board of Trustees of the Cal State University, where the case actually ended up being dismissed, where an individual brought a PAGA claim for workplace safety issues related, for workplace safety issues. And we can imagine that this will be used in the COVID context. In that case, the case was dismissed because it was a public employer, but for private employers, the court made fairly clear that private employers may be subject to PAGA actions for violations of Cal OSHA standards. So if nothing else scares you, that might. So there are a number of legal requirements. Again, understanding paid time off is one of the key ones. The CPP, the providing the notice and exclusions, a system of tracking COVID-19, which will be applicable also to your workers' comp and potentially, and also reporting still to the California Department of Public Health if there is an outbreak. Outbreaks for purposes of workers' comp are slightly different than for purposes of reporting to the California Department of Public Health. The department requires, if you have 3 or more in a 14-day period, that needs to be reported. And you should be recording return to work status. Training topics that you will need to cover are here. You still need to talk about how to prevent the spread of the disease, what health conditions make people more susceptible, how folks should do self-screening, and that it is really important not to come to work with positive test results or diagnosis symptoms, or if exposed. You would think after a year that people understand that, and yet we have certainly seen folks that show up at work with a positive test. So making it clear, both just for safety's sake and from a liability perspective as well, that you make it quite clear to folks that that is not acceptable. When they should seek medical attention, when it is time to return to work, about washing their hands, physical distancing, how do you use a mask? I know that sounds ridiculous again after all this time, but you'd be surprised how many people claw the front of a mask or put their hands underneath it, or think that if they, I don't know, they should be removing it from the ear part. And then finally, the leave benefits information, you must advise about that. So we're going to put up a polling question now, and I'm going to, there's 2 of them that are coming up. I think that Alex will pop up onto the screen, hopefully. Thank you. So the question is, in the last year, have you experienced any of the following concerns? And before you answer, I'm going to go through what these are, but I'm going to let you know, this is anonymous. I don't see who's answering what, so you should feel relatively safe in the space answering these questions. Intrusive memories, which are things like memories of negative events that have occurred over the past year, flashbacks, upsetting dreams, nightmares. Avoidance, just not wanting to think about particular events or shutting down through distractions or avoiding certain places or people. Have you experienced negative changes in your thinking or mood? So negative thoughts about yourself or other people or the world, or a sense of hopelessness? Have you had memory problems, difficulty maintaining relationships, or simply feeling detached? And finally, have you experienced changes in physical and emotional reactions, such as maybe drinking too much or driving too fast or having trouble sleeping or eating? So the choices are yes, no, or I haven't thought about it. And then there's a second question, which is, have you experienced anyone in your close family or close friends who became seriously ill or died from COVID? And if you could answer both of those questions.
Leslie, while people are reviewing those, there's a question that popped up in the chat asking whether daily attestation questions will be required.
Certainly those are recommended. Whether or not they will be required is another issue, but for now, yes, all of those same things are in place. They have not been removed, and I don't know why you would want to at this point. Those questions usually take very little time to respond to. A second question, I do see it. Could we ask these kinds of questions, the ones I'm asking you, to our employees? I would not recommend that. Now, if you wanted to do it also as an anonymous survey, just to see the scope of whatever concerns you have, you might. But I'm going to talk about walking into the area of having to engage in interactive process and having knowledge of somebody's mental health issues. So can we see whether or not what responses we've gotten here?
So should we end polling now?
Yeah, you can end the polling now.
Okay.
I think we should have responses by now, I would think. And what does it look like? All right. Thank you. So really interesting. As you can see here, 72% of you have experienced some of those concerns, some or all. And 61% have experienced, or I know the numbers show up slightly differently on different screens, but well over a majority have experienced losses of close friends and family, either who became quite ill or who actually died. We can close the poll now. Thank you. So why did I ask those questions? I asked those questions because we're talking about, many people talk about returning to normal. But what is normal? And does normal, or what we thought of as normal, is that normal now? What these numbers show me, what those responses to the questions show, is that we all, even those of us who didn't have the direct somebody in my family got really sick or died, as a community, we have been exposed over the past 14 months to trauma and shock, our individual and group, both again in terms of the pandemic itself and in terms of a lot of things that are happening in the wider society. So we as lawyers, because I'm talking to a group of lawyers, are already deal with often with what I would consider trauma, with fear of failure, fear of the unknown. We tend as a group to be much more control oriented. We've been taught that emotional connection is, or at least can be, a weakness. And I would say that the pandemic may have taught many of us a lesson about how much of a myth that is. So we need to look at, as you're reopening, what is going to be the new normal? Because I don't think that the old normal is ever coming back, or certainly not at the flip of a switch. What kind of responses do we expect from people as they return? And we need to be aware of whether it's the disorder or just simply post-traumatic stress, that there's going to be some stress from the trauma that we as a society have experienced. And there's also an opportunity for post-traumatic growth. And I'm going to talk about that for a moment in the next slide. But returning to work mindfully means looking at how we change our relationship to the stress we have experienced. And it is going to require practicing a lot of patience as we come back. Just as mindfulness requires patience and practice and balancing doing and being. So I said I was going to talk for a moment about post-traumatic stress and also post-traumatic growth. So post-traumatic stress as a disorder is a mental health condition that needs to be diagnosed by somebody who is an expert, a medical provider in that area. It is typically triggered by, and again, these are definitions taken from American Psychological Association works, by a deeply disturbing or terrifying event or set of events that you either witness or experience yourself. And it may lead to some of the things that were the things I listed as potential issues that have arisen for people or concerns around the intrusive thoughts and the avoidance and all of the rest of those. And also to note that they don't necessarily happen immediately. It might happen immediately after an event. It may be delayed depending on what mind state we are in. And they may, but before you get a diagnosis, they would likely be interfering with normal daily tasks, but the stress that we've experienced is real. There is no specific timeline, and the symptoms also can change from person to person and over time. So important to note that those may be happening to people, those kinds of symptoms, again, as we saw from the survey. But what's post-traumatic growth? And is this something, oh, yay, we've all experienced trauma together, so now we all get to grow together? Yes and no. What is post-traumatic growth? It's a theory, first of all. It is not a diagnosis of some sort. It was developed by a couple of analysts in the 1990s that attempts to explain the growth that sometimes follows trauma. But one of the things that they found is that in order for growth to occur, there needs to be some resiliency either during the time of trauma or after the time of trauma. It may even start with sort of PTSD symptoms, but then a positive change develops out of it. For example, people who've lost a number of people and then experience a new appreciation of life, that kind of thing, or a newfound sense of personal strength, or a new focus on helping other people. It is a little bit different from resilience itself. Resiliency is the personal ability to, quote, bounce back. Traumatic growth is what happened or what can happen. It doesn't always happen. And I want to make that very clear. There's nothing wrong with you if it doesn't happen. It can happen when you have difficulty bouncing, when someone who typically has difficulty bouncing back challenges their own core beliefs, endures a struggle, and then finds a sense of personal growth. So this requires some work and some attention. It's not like an automatic thing that happens. It takes a lot of time and energy and struggle. And it does occur more often with people who are in a resilient state when the trauma does occur. So as you're looking at these events, you want to look at how your reopening plan is going to address well-being. Have you even thought about it? Is it just, oh, are my desks clean and my phone sterilized? Or am I thinking about, wait a minute, people are coming back from a long time of not being in a space where they're sharing. They may be fearful. They may have forgotten how to engage. They may have forgotten how to put on their pants because we've been on Zoom screens where you can only see us from the waist up. Are you prepared for trauma responses of those who you work with as they return to work? Do you have some means of supporting folks who are having a tough time, even if it's just a list of resources for them? Are you prepared for addressing guilt and shame that may accompany those people who think, well, I didn't lose someone close to me, so that makes me feel guilty. Sort of survivor's guilt or shame. And are you yourself practicing for the changes that are happening? They are happening whether we want them to or not. So there are some legal tools as well as mindfulness tools. And we're going to start with the legal tools for addressing the risks. So the first one is leaves of absence. So knowing that those might happen. So the first thing is the California Supplemental Paid Sick Leave, which I'm going to go into in a little bit more depth. It applies to employers now with 25 or more employees. So if you don't have 25 or more, or you're counseling a client who doesn't have 25 or more, this does not apply. This is different than the Supplemental Paid Sick Leave last year, which only applied to those businesses with 500 or more. There are other leaves of absence, the ones we're already familiar with: FMLA, CFRA, the ADA accommodations, and FEHA accommodations, noting just as an asterisk that the CFRA has had some really substantial changes since last year, effective January 1 this year. The California Family Rights Act, which is our state equivalent to the FMLA, now applies to businesses with 5 or more employees. We have interpreted that to mean 5 or more employees anywhere, even if you don't have, say you had some in another state. And there is no geographic restriction anymore. So those of you who did not have to follow the CFRA before may well have to now. The emergency temporary standards, which talked about excluding people and having to compensate them if they actually were exposed at work, and excluding them in any case. That there are state benefits available potentially for people who do become ill, short-term disability, for people who are caring for others, paid family leave. Workers' comp, if the absences are work-related. There's also hazard pay and a reinstatement for some industries. This is more for if you're advising someone else as opposed to in our industry, which it does not apply to. And then there are still federal benefits that are voluntary now as opposed to required for smaller businesses under the FFCRA and the American Rescue Plan Act for time off, and COBRA extensions for individuals who lose or have lost their jobs going all the way back to October 2019. So pre-pandemic. So let me talk for a minute about the California Supplemental Paid Sick Leave. It is a new bucket of 80 hours, of up to 80 hours, it should say up to 80 hours of paid time off for full-time employees. That's 80 hours. As I said, more than 25 employees is the, so 25 or less, you are not subject to it. 26 or more, you are. It went into effect at the end of March, so just a few weeks ago. However, it is retroactive to the beginning of the year, very importantly. And it does require notice to employees and a separate line item on the wage statements. So if you are not doing that, and you are following the category of 26 plus employees, you need to think about it yourself for your own entity. And there are expanded reasons over 2020's reasons for it. It looks more like the federal rules do now. So you can use it for vaccinations and for symptoms related to the vaccinations, also to care for family, for childcare, in addition to quarantine or isolation for self. The reasons are in these 3 buckets: caring for yourself. So you are subject to a quarantine or isolation period. This is also different language from what we saw last year. Before it said there was an order Now it says a period. So it could be a recommended period of quarantine or isolation by a healthcare professional or by state or local health departments and or the CDC. If you've actually been advised by a healthcare provider to quarantine, or if you are actually experiencing symptoms of COVID and seeking a medical diagnosis, so having a test done, for example. Then there are vaccine-related reasons, so getting a vaccine and or symptoms as a result of that vaccine are covered. And then there is caring for a family member who's subject to quarantine or isolation, or is caring for a child whose school is closed. It does say because of COVID-19 on the premises. We do not know how this is going to be interpreted yet. Does this mean that there has to have been a case or cases of COVID-19 at the school, or simply that they closed the school because of fear of that? That's not clear. I would go with the broader definition until we know more. Also to note that California employers must provide this in addition to the leave mandated by local ordinances and or any voluntary leave. However, the other COVID-specific leaves for the same purposes can be used as a credit. So they run concurrently. You don't have to give them one leave after another leave after another leave that's paid by you. If you are a smaller organization, you may be able to get a tax credit if you are voluntarily providing the federal benefit. So that it doesn't actually cost you.
Leslie, sorry to interrupt. You may be getting to this, but do the same anti-retaliation provisions apply to the supplemental sick leave that apply to the regular California sick leave?
Yes, they do. You cannot terminate somebody for using it. In fact, you cannot require them to use it. They have to choose to use it. So also, if you had people who used it in the past 3 months since the beginning of the year, and they use their PTO or vacation time or sick time for it, they're supposed to ask you if they want to have those hours put back in their bank and taken out of their California supplemental paid sick leave. You could ask them if they want to do that. You can't require them to do it. The only place you can require use of California supplemental paid sick leave is if you are excluding someone from the workplace under the emergency temporary standards because they've been exposed in the workplace and you would be already required to compensate them. You can require that they use this California supplemental paid sick leave bank if they have it first. The other thing that we see as a question a lot is, well, I have a generous paid sick leave. Do I have to give this to? Or I have a generous PTO policy. Do I have to give this to? The statute makes this very clear. The leave is supplemental and you may not require an employee to use any other paid leave. This is a quote directly from the legislation. Or paid time off available to the employee under a policy that is not specific to COVID-19. Actually, as I say that, I'm not sure whether it's from the statute itself or from the FAQs that followed. And you may not require the employee to use vacation time, or for sure, this is in the statute, you cannot have them use regular California paid sick leave. And when I say it needs to be a separate line item, it cannot be with your regular paid sick leave. It needs to be separate from that as well. So you have a line that is maybe vacation, a line that is California paid sick leave, and then a separate line that is California supplemental paid sick leave. This provision also goes through September 30th right now, unless extended, that is when it will expire. So what are the top mistakes that I have seen people make, others in my firm have seen, is not understanding of providing the paid leave, particularly for the first quarter of the year where the law wasn't yet here. Not giving notice of this new law. Everybody should already have notice. If you haven't given it, give it now. I think there may be a model notice online for this. In fact, there is in English and in Spanish. Failing to put necessary information on the wage statements, not correctly calculating rate of pay for non-exempt employees, limiting the reasons beyond what the law requires. If your particular policy is more limited, you can use it for the reasons that match, but you cannot limit it beyond those in the law. And you may not require medical documentation for the leave. Think about this for a moment. I went and got a vaccine. I had a reaction to it. I am not going to go to my doctor when I know that the reaction I had was related to it. There would be no reason for me to reach out. I got sick. I was sick for a day or two, and now I'm okay. You cannot ask for medical documentation around that. Can you ask if someone has been vaccinated? We will get to that. So for COVID-related absences, you want to consider the various leave of absences that are available. You want to establish a COVID-19 accommodation process and also use the interactive process where it is appropriate. Review state and local ordinances. You want to provide information about state benefits as well as the other benefits, so short-term disability, unemployment insurance, paid family leave, all the things that you would have to provide when someone takes a leave of absence, if they are. And consider or reconsider if you canceled your voluntary federal benefits, thinking, well, I have to provide California supplemental paid sick leave. Why would I have both? The reason you would have both is so that you can obtain the tax credit, which is a $1 for dollar out of your payroll taxes that you retain. Let's talk about vaccinations for a while, because I know this is a super hot topic. So vaccinations have both legal implications and the potential for affecting morale in both directions. Some employees only feel, and since we call this, being safe, I'm only going to feel safe if everyone around me is vaccinated, and I don't want to be in a workplace where everyone is not vaccinated. Other employees are going to put their privacy above that concern, even if they do want people to get vaccinated, and they don't want employers asking the question, and we'll talk about whether or not you can. And or there are people who are actually afraid of receiving the vaccine for a variety of reasons. And different communities may also react differently. I do have a question. There is no tax credit for the California supplemental paid sick leave. That is correct. If you are qualified for, I'm going to flip back for a moment to answer this question because we were just there. If you are eligible for the federal tax credit, and you are voluntarily offering FFCRA, or now it's the American Rescue Plan Act, voluntary continuance of that, then you can take a tax credit under that and run the two things concurrently. So the same 80 hours that is applicable to the emergency paid sick leave would be the California supplemental paid sick leave, and you can take a tax credit. But if either you don't qualify under the FFCRA/ARPA, or you're not providing the federal benefit, there is no tax credit. Okay. I want to make sure I don't throw this bullet point away here, that different communities may react differently to vaccine requirements based on their personal or personal experience, or the experience for their community, and just knowing that exists. So evaluating a safe path with vaccines, one of the things you want to think about as we go through mandatory versus voluntary vaccination is, what is your goal? How are you best going to achieve that goal? And you may be surprised about how that works. Okay, so what are the risks associated with vaccinations? There's both legal and personnel risks. If you make assignments to particular roles based on whether an employee was vaccinated. And it, again, goes both ways. You don't want to put somebody who is going to be in contact constantly with people who are perhaps potentially ill or who could make other people ill. But you also don't want to exclude people from opportunity if, for example, they can't get a vaccine for one reason or another. You may consider moving unvaccinated employees to positions with minimal customer, employee, client contact, but you need to be careful about whether those positions result in fewer advancement opportunities, and we will talk about the direct threat and whether or not you can do that. You have to be cognizant of perceived disability discrimination claims. You're seeing me as disabled because I didn't get vaccinated, I can't get vaccinated for a medical reason. You may require more PPE for unvaccinated employees because the employer has an obligation to ensure the safety of all workers and customers and clients. So, first question we often get, may an employer require its employees to be vaccinated? The short answer in California, and actually across the country generally, is yes, but there are several significant caveats. You have to be prepared, if you are mandating it, to provide reasonable accommodations to employees with disabilities and or who have sincerely held religious objections to getting a vaccine. The EEOC has made clear that the employer can mandate vaccines. They can keep unvaccinated employees out of the workplace if the employer determines that they pose a direct threat due to a significant risk of substantial harm to the health and safety of the individual or others that cannot be eliminated or reduced by reasonable accommodation. So you have to do that evaluation. Can't just say, I'm not going to let you back because you're not vaccinated. You need to look at why you are keeping them out. Is there a direct threat? Again, I'll go into that in a little bit more detail on the next slide. And not only has the EEOC made this finding, but the DFEH as FAQs, which are pretty thorough, and I do recommend that you take a look at them. Employers may require vaccination as long as you're not discriminating or retaliating based upon a protected characteristic and you are providing reasonable accommodation. So this is because vaccinations are not considered a medical examination by the EEOC. I mean, one can argue about whether or not you think that's right, but that is the way it has been viewed. But if you start asking medical related questions about the vaccine, you may be entering the disability related inquiry, and that's regulated by the ADA and in California by the Fair Employment and Housing Act. So if you mandate a vaccine and someone says, I'm not going to get it, and then you say, why not? And they say, because I have a medical condition that does not permit me to get it, then you're now potentially going into a medical related dialogue, which is going to have a lot of implications for employers. So the ADA wellness regulations are not involved if the employer doesn't provide or pay for the vaccine. So that's a set of regulations also requiring certain accommodations. And so if you just say, go get a vaccine, we're not providing it, we're not paying for it. Paying for the supplemental paid sick leave is a different issue aside from that. And we're not going to ask you any questions about it. When you go, if you have been vaccinated, you need to be aware that they ask you if you have had a reaction, what kind of reaction you've had, has it been to another vaccine? Those are all the kinds of questions that need to be asked when the vaccine is given. If the employer is actually giving it and they have, then you're going to be subject to obtaining that information, which you probably don't want to have. If all you're doing is confirming someone has been vaccinated, that is a different question. But once you ask why, you're entering dangerous territory. So let's talk now about this direct threat evaluation. So COVID-19 meets the direct threat definition under the ADA in many cases. No, it doesn't say in all cases. So a failure to be vaccinated generally poses a direct threat to the health and safety of other coworkers, but that's not the end of the evaluation. Also note the term and how it feels about a safe workspace. Direct threat is an abandonment of safety. We can't have direct threat and safety in the same space contemporaneously. And the EEOC has said that this falls into that unsafe category. But what you need to look at is 4 factors: how long, the duration of the risk, the nature and severity of the potential harm. Again, is somebody able to go in an office and close the door and not engage with people? Or is it someone who's going to be in constant contact with other folks? What's the likelihood of the potential harm and the imminence of it? And as a result of this, you may have to continue to permit remote work as an accommodation for folks who can't get vaccinated or have a significant risk of contracting the disease where it would be perhaps more deadly. So if there is an individual who can't be vaccinated due to a disability, then the employer has to determine whether it can provide a reasonable accommodation that would eliminate or reduce the risk. And you can't exclude the employee from the workplace or take any other action unless the interactive process of finding a reasonable accommodation that eliminates that threat fails.
Leslie, there's a question related to this in the chat, whether if an employee says they can't receive the vaccine due to a disability, can the employer ask for a medical confirmation?
You would treat this the same way you would treat any other disability related inquiry. If someone says, I need an accommodation because I have a disability, and that is in fact what they are requesting when you say this is a condition of employment, and we're saying you must get it, and they say, I can't, they're requesting an accommodation. And so you would use the same process that hopefully you have in place for any disability, which would typically include a medical confirmation, not of the underlying condition, that is not the question, but what accommodation, what are the restrictions on the individual? The fact that they cannot get a vaccine would be the restriction.
Yeah.
Okay, so we will talk about choosing not to get a vaccine momentarily because this is mandatory, but yeah, I will talk about that. And if I don't get to it, please ding me again, but I'm pretty sure we have that in here. So there is also the impact of the fact that the vaccines that have been that we have been using, that have been permitted to be used, have been approved according to emergency use authorization. So vaccines go through an FDA approval before they can be used. It was expedited during this emergency. And federal regulations provide the government with the discretion to require that individuals be told that they can refuse the use of a medical product such as a vaccine, which seems inconsistent with them saying, but we're going to require that you get them. The theory here is that actually these EUA regulations have to do with whether or not a medical provider can refuse to provide medical care based on the refusal to get the vaccine, and not whether or not it's a condition of employment. However, I want to note here that there has been a lawsuit already filed on this and others that we see coming down the line. There has not been a determination yet where the mandating vaccination based on the EU regulation would not be permitted. So one of the things here is, do you want to possibly be a test case for this? I do have a question about if the employer is requiring the vaccine, you don't need to offer to pay for it if there's a cost. No, that would not be true in California. If there is a cost, you will have to pay for it because we need to reimburse for business expenses that we are requiring. And there has been clear also guidance on that issue. But what that means then is that you're going to have to comply with the ADA wellness regulations, and you're going to have to, I do have some information about ERISA that goes with this. I am not your benefits specialist, but I will touch on this issue for you just so to flag it for you. There are a couple of other considerations that go with mandating COVID-19 vaccinations. So there is some risk that certain employees could have a negative physiological reaction to a vaccine, leading to a workers' comp claim. And collective bargaining obligations, for most of you, this is not going to be an issue, but if you maybe had a client or you do have, or happen to be listening in from an organization that has a unionized workforce, union employees owe a duty to bargain about mandatory subjects of bargaining, and the mandate for vaccines likely is one of those issues. So you should have protocols in place when you do get a request for a religious objection or a medical objection. Your HR, if you have it, or whoever is responsible for those duties in your organization, should receive training on implementing and administering a mandatory program, and you should establish record-keeping protocols for if you're collecting any confidential medical information, what are you going to do with it? And there are some pretty strict requirements around privacy related to that. There also is a new OSHA guidance that was just issued last week around having to log adverse reactions to COVID-19 vaccines on OSHA 300 logs if you are mandating the vaccine. So you can see there's a lot of reasons to not mandate a vaccine. If you are not requiring it, but simply encouraging it or recommending it, then you don't have to record those adverse effects on the Cal OSHA 300 log. All right, so here's the little piece I said about vaccines and ERISA. If you pay for or provide an employee vaccine, and as again, where you might have to if you are mandating it, assuming there was a cost, that likely is going to create what's called an employer-sponsored health plan. So if you currently have an ERISA plan or ERISA health plan, you need to comply with ERISA for this plan as well and file all the appropriate forms and consider your COBRA requirements and all of those things. What you can do is incorporate the payment for or providing of the vaccine into your existing health plan, but you need to know to do that. So reach out to the experts in the benefits field, reach out to your plan administrator about a wrap document or amendment to the plan to include this if you're going to do it, or seeing whether or not you need it according to the terms of your plan. Remembering also that you may have individuals on your plan who are not your employees, spouses and things like that, or people more concerned, people who are not on your plan who are employees because they're on their spouse's plan, but they're maybe getting, if you're paying for it, providing it, getting the vaccine through you, so they're not in your plan. And that's where this is more likely to come up. So what could you do instead of a mandatory vaccine? You could incentivize it. So if you provide an incentive to getting the vaccine and it is connected to a health plan, the payment for providing of it, then the HIPAA wellness regulations will also apply. And if an employee cannot achieve the incentive due to a health condition, this is for health conditions only, not religious, then they have to be provided an alternative way to get the incentive. What does that mean? I have a health condition. My doctor has said you should not get vaccinated. And my employer is providing an extra day of PTO, is providing a gift, let's say a gift card to someplace for everybody who gets a vaccine. I can't earn it by getting a vaccine because I can't get vaccinated, but I want my gift card. I shouldn't be cut out because I can't get it. And so the employer may have to provide something like, you need to do additional training for an hour on how the disease is spread and what PPE you might have to wear both for yourself and others, and something like that. And then I can get the gift card as well. If you are making a medical inquiry into healthcare incentives at all, or for purposes of the healthcare incentive, then the ADA wellness regulations also apply. If the incentive is not connected to a health plan, then the HIPAA wellness regulations don't apply. So don't mandate where the vaccine, if you are encouraging people to get it, but not mandating it, but you say, but if you get it, we want you to get it here. That is going to create HIPAA wellness regulation obligations. If there's no medical inquiry, then the ADA wellness regulations don't apply. So if you don't inquire and you don't tell them where to get it, you make it voluntary, none of these regulations apply to you. All right, so what is your goal with vaccines? The most people vaccinated, the most people comfortable, in which case you may want to do an initial survey to find out whether people are already planning to get vaccinated. Because there really is a morale issue about this. Is what we are proposing going to achieve the goal? And I'm going to give you just an anecdotal story about this, because it turns out that Americans tend to be, and I'm not going to speak for others, but Americans, it seems, tend to be quite insistent that they are free to do as they like. That is part of what's built into much of our thinking around various things. And so I actually had a client in the healthcare industry that this did not have to do with COVID. This was a flu vaccine. And so it was a hospital-based entity that had for years had voluntary flu vaccines. You got it if you wanted to. They encouraged it. They made it easy for folks to get it. If they didn't get it, they had to use more PPE with, if they were in patient contact and such. Then they decided a couple of years ago that they were going to mandate it because they just wanted everybody to do it. They thought it would be safer. And they told everyone, you need to get it. Now, mind you, they had records of who got it and who didn't going back, because they were keeping records of it at the time. And what would you find out but that people who got a flu vaccine in prior years suddenly found a new religion or had a disability that they hadn't had previously, and they were no longer able, and I'll put that in quotes for these purposes, to get the vaccine. So it actually did the opposite of what they intended. Fewer people got vaccinated once it was mandated than when it was voluntary. And I'm just throwing that out there to show you that sometimes things don't go the way we think. The other thing to look at is, what's your plan with regard to people who aren't your employees? What about your clients? Are you going to be checking in on them? Are you going to mandate that they have a vaccine before they come into your space? Or are you going to say, well, we're going to, require PPE if they don't? What's your plan? And what happens if we find out that a booster is needed 6 months or a year from when people got vaccinated initially? Remembering that some people got vaccinated as early as end of December. We're already getting close to a 6-month mark for some folks. And it won't, certainly within the next 6 months, a lot of people will be in the 6 to 12 month mark of when they got it. And then are you going to mandate that as well? Is it going to be voluntary? Just putting that as an item to be considered on your list. And then thinking about, are you going to distinguish between different classifications of people in the workplace? Are they going to have to wear the red letter if they didn't get vaccinated, or if they did get vaccinated? Are you segregating people? Are you allowing people who are vaccinated to return to the workplace first? Sorry about that.
There's a couple of questions in chat. I don't know if this is a good point to address them. Maybe not.
I will keep going and then we'll get to them. So I want you to leave space for the possibility that your voluntary plan may have a greater participation rate and also may not impact morale in a negative way. And then what's your priority in planning for it? And will there be outsiders? Again, that's the letter, the red letter. So what types of vaccine incentives have I seen? Extra PTO to use for obtaining the vaccine, or just as an award for receiving it. For obtaining it, they already have California supplemental paid sick leave if it hasn't already been used, but you could still give them something, a raffle, a gift. I a gift of food, a lunch, but not without everybody gathering together without masks. Probably not a great idea yet. Look, don't just randomly pick something. Think for a moment about what motivates your employees. And that's where you want to go if you want to get the greatest participation. So what do you do with employees who refuse to return to work? And I think this was a question that we got. So here's an important thing to note. Under under OSHA, federal OSHA, as well as under Cal OSHA, employees may refuse to do a job because of hazardous conditions if three circumstances are met. The employee believes that he or she faces death or serious injury, and the situation is so clearly hazardous, any reasonable person would believe the same things. So again, if you can show that you've taken steps and that the workplace is safe for these reasons, this will be a hard bullet point to achieve, but this is also a serious illness. The employee's tried where possible to get the employer to correct the condition and has been unable to obtain the correction, and there's no other way to do the job safely. And finally, the situation is so urgent that the employee doesn't have time to eliminate the hazard through regulatory channels such as calling OSHA. So you can't simply say, I'm not returning because I don't want to. I'm not doing it. That is not a reason. And here's where it gets a little tricky. I'm not going to return because I'm afraid. Is that fear actually rising to the level of a mental health concern where you might have to accommodate it? Or is it simply, you know what? I'm just scared and I don't want to come back. I haven't been out of my house in a year, and the idea of stepping outside is just not comfortable right now, and so you can't ask me to come back. An employer refuses to return because it's inconvenient. So there could also be that, hey, you know what? I don't have to fight with traffic in LA right now, so I'm not coming back. That is not a reason. That does not work. That should say, or has no medical basis for safety or safety basis for remaining outside of the workplace, doesn't have a legitimate excuse. Sorry for the typos there. But please be careful, very careful about health issues, physical and mental, that might require accommodation. And this is a place where you need to be particularly sensitive in not digging before you have to dig, but in making sure, is there an accommodation you need for any health-related reason? And, you know, they can say no. And if they say no, please document it. So mental health issues, I mentioned this at the very beginning. A recent survey through Kaiser Foundation showed a very, very substantial uptick in adults who are reporting anxiety or depressive disorder. Now, the fact is they are actually reporting a disorder. This is self-reporting. But if you look at January to June of 2019, the number of adults who reported was 11%. In January of 2021, it was 41.1%. Reporting a disorder. That means that mental health issues and the potential need for accommodation is fairly high. There's also been, the same study showed and other studies also have showed a significant rise in substance use, difficulty sleeping and eating, and worsening chronic health conditions. So all of those things may impact whether people actually can, as a matter of medical reasons, return into the workplace, or how they return. Is this, again, a flipped switch or a staggered reopening, maybe a rotating reopening? Some people come and some don't. And I also just wanted to mention, to close out this section, that belonging, which is something that has been sort of absent during this last period for many people, is really important to humans. Although some employees may not want to return, we have a deep-seated need to belong, almost all of us. If you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, he doesn't put this at the very base. He puts it somewhere in the middle, but it is certainly a motivator of human behavior. And the pandemic has completely disrupted our sense of what it means to belong, where we belong, and what we belong to. So just noting that the plan for returning to work may very well impact our sense of belonging, either encouraging people, supporting the need to belong, but it could undermine that sense as well. And certainly if you have people, segregated out, it can actually exacerbate that problem. So let's do one more polling question here. Oh, there he is. Maybe? No, there it comes. Okay. So here's the question. It's very simple. Will you be in a workplace that continues to permit remote work at least some of the time on a permanent basis? Yes, no, or either you're undecided or you just don't know. You don't know because you're not the one making the decisions, or you don't know because you haven't considered it. So is your workplace one that's going to continue to permit remote work at least some of the time on a permanent basis? And I think we can, I don't know, Alex, you can see if most of the people have responded, and so we could close the poll. Pretty straightforward question. Okay. So more than half of you have said yes, and another huge, big chunk, almost a third, have said, I don't know yet. I don't know, or I'm undecided. A much smaller percentage are saying no, no one's going to be able to. And this is one of the biggest, we can close this now. This is one of the biggest changes we've seen for so many years. We were firmly convinced that remote work was going to devastate the way we do work, that it was impossible, not improbable, not difficult, but impossible for non-exempt employees to work remotely. And it was going to really disrupt our practice by not having people in the workplace at the same time, even if for many of us, we were emailing our colleagues from across the hall and never seeing them. But what we've learned is, you know what, it might work. That doesn't mean we want it to work 100% of the time. It doesn't mean we might not want a hybrid pattern, but we've learned some important lessons. There we go. So if you are going to have telecommuting, or if you're thinking about it, here are some best practices. And since we have such a large majority of people who are either going to have it or are considering it, you want to clarify which positions are eligible for work from home, both during and I should say, and after the pandemic, and identify a written process for requests and approvals for work from home going forward. What is it going to look like? What does it look like right now? And is that going to change? Explaining your return to work protocol, what the company's policies and procedures are, and providing direction on who you need to notify and when, if you're symptomatic, if you can't work from home, all of those types of things. Another question that comes up a lot is, does workers' comp apply here if somebody's working from home? Now, many of you may have looked at this already, but in a word, it does, depending on the nature of a home injury. And there's some funny examples in the workers' comp guidance about, if you trip over your dog going to get coffee in your kitchen, that's not a workers' comp injury, even if you work from home. But if you've got carpal tunnel syndrome from typing at home, it is. So what you do want to probably do is ask employees to designate a specific area of their home, especially if they're non-exempt, for break places, and attempt a virtual site check of the employee's home office so that you can make sure ergonomically it's safe and otherwise, or you can have them send you photos if you have people working from home to make sure you're also meeting those needs, particularly if you want them to continue to work from home as opposed to it being voluntary. And I will note that the idea of voluntary is a pretty broad definition of where California courts would likely find that people have been required to work from home. You want to have very clear expectations. You want to let people know if there's going to be any kind of surveillance or monitoring of like when they're accessing their computers. You want to have regular check-ins. You want to have flexibility and predictability in scheduling meetings if you're going to have people working remotely or you're going to be doing it yourself. And you want to also consider using a single or a couple of different communication platforms, like a single platform for one purpose and another platform for another, so that folks aren't having to check a whole bunch of places to get the necessary information. Then we here in California have expense reimbursement requirements that come from a number of places. This is where is it voluntary or not comes into play. And I would certainly err on the side of assuming, unless you say, we have an office, we know you're able to come in, and the person just says, yeah, you know what, I like working from home when you let me do that, and they're going to work from home a good percentage or all of the time. Otherwise, expense reimbursements are going to be required. If you do have non-exempt employees working sometime or all of the time remotely again, these are where your biggest risks are, so be very clear in your policies and parameters around this. And this is one of the things that folks hadn't necessarily thought about a whole lot, but this has happened. And it may have actually happened in your organization without you even knowing it. Have your employees, any of your employees, moved out of state during this pandemic and you didn't know it, and they're working remotely? We've had lots of questions from people saying, well, I want to move to a cheaper area. I want to move to another state. I don't want you to change my compensation. I don't need to change anything else, but we've shown we can work from home. Why can't I live in Montana? You need to be careful that you know where your employees are, because there may be compliance with local employment laws that you're not doing. You need to check your workers' comp policy and make sure it applies. You need to check what unemployment benefits would they be entitled to in the state where we are, in the state where they are, in the state where their work is, quote, being done. What does that mean? And there may be tax-related issues with regard to withholdings and reimbursements in different states, different requirements. So you want to conduct an audit, figure out if anyone's working remotely, out of state, out of county is less of a concern, but not a concern. Because here in California, for example, for paid sick leave requirements, if people are working, let's say in the city of Beverly Hills has different restrictions in the city of Los Angeles. And so noting that there might be more or different benefits depending on where the individual is actually working from. You want to make sure you have a robust remote working policy and consider consulting your insurers about extraterritorial insurance coverage for anyone who is not working in the state or the area. So finally, the last section, which is on best practices for reopening, which are the items that I listed at the very beginning, with perhaps one of the most important being prepared to be mindful and flexible and inclusive, and then ensuring a safe workplace. So what does that look like? That was the first topic. Comply with all safety and health orders. That's the legal aspect. Have your COVID prevention plan in place. Determine what your vaccination policy is going to be and why. And then see, do I want to do, again, like a survey saying, maybe send out to people where they can anonymously respond. Have you been vaccinated? Do you plan on getting vaccinated? If 99% of your people say they are, maybe you don't need a mandate. Determine what testing policy you have, if any. Those are all things that you should, and there are places where you will have to test if there's, for example, an outbreak, but otherwise. Then you want to determine the workplace or remote status. So which positions need to return primarily or totally, which ones can work remotely, and which ones are going to be hybrids. Look at the needs of your particular business and how it's been working. And a need isn't an I want. I want is different than I need. This reminds me of when my son was like 2 years old, and my father used to say, I need coffee. And so my son banged on his high chair and said, I need coffee. Clearly not a need, even though he felt it was. And so looking at, do I need my assistant here? Do I want my assistant here? What do I need this person to do? What are the essential functions of the position? And if they do require someone physically on the ground, why? And make sure that's in your description. And generally, you're going to focus on the position, not the person, of course, with exceptions for reasonable accommodation. You want to develop a realistic timeline. Again, not a flipped switch, but assessing your needs, monitoring state and local developments, making it very clear that these things could also change. Here's our timeline as of right now, and this may change. We're going to be back with everyone in the office by the fall, by midsummer, remembering that before June 15th, that should not be a mandate under the regulations that are currently in place. You want to give employees time to plan. Childcare, travel, maybe they sold one of their cars, whatever it is. Consider phases and consider how you're going to address the most common employee concerns so that you're consistent. Develop a remote work plan. We already talked about that, with expectations, days people are going to be working, noting that you can alter it, and whether or not out-of-state locations permitted, but also looking at whether or not maybe you want a day or a week, a day a month, particular time that is your collaboration day, where you expect people to be in the office, and that they know that. So be prepared to be mindful and flexible, recognizing that circumstances may and probably will change. So build into your written policies and any trainings your ability to adjust. Think about what feels safe in this moment. Not what was safe last year, not what was safe pre-pandemic, not what was safe at the beginning of the pandemic. What's safe now? Remembering that other individuals and group traumas are going to be brought into the workplace in addition to the pandemic. So there's been a lot that has happened in this last year. How are you going to address these issues? Do you have DE&I? What are you doing with that? Being present is where the work is done. It's not the only goal, though, of being mindful. Being in the present is important, and if you're not aware of what's happening right now, you can't do the work. But doing the work is the point. Getting to a place of more calm, of more contentment, of better balance is the work. That's the goal, not simply the awareness, but what do we do with that for ourselves and for others? So how do you do that? Make sure the lines of communication are open. Be prepared to listen, really deeply listen. Don't ignore fears, because they may also be rising to the level of mental health issues. Remember, many things we thought 14 months ago were impossible have not been. Check your own knowledge and beliefs. How have they changed? And do you need to develop a wellness and mindful safety net for yourself or for others? And let's close up with talking just for a moment about, what your checklist looks like, which we touched on all of these issues. But more importantly, how do we stay connected? How do we get connected for those who have not felt that? You want to promote well-being and inclusion. What is our company culture? What was it before and what is it now? And maybe this is a really opportune time to change things you didn't like. And how are we maintaining any commitment to inclusion and diversity? What is happening with that right now? Acknowledge fears and concerns and show empathy. You need to speak to the human first so that people feel seen and heard. Consider talking about how grateful you are that people are back and they're alive. Thanking people for their contributions and asking what you can do to help so that you create a sense of community. You may still be prioritizing physical distance, but you can also prioritize social connection. In isolation, there isn't a sense of community, which leads to that fear and uncertainty. So you want to create a shared sense of community and engagement, and that is going to shift as more people come into the workplace, remembering those who still are not there for whatever reason. Make sure that you are ensuring equal access to resources. It's not the time to discontinue impactful and meaningful programming that you may have started. So support your mentoring programs, support affinity networks, support critical organizations that support diversity in this industry, because we need it. And finally, don't forget about yourself. You need to care for yourself before you can help others. And it is very common for leaders to take care of everyone but themselves. Set a standard, show people how to care for themselves so that they do it as well, and pay attention to your own emotional state so that you can, and get support to show people that support is important. Finally, this is in your slides, but this is a list of complementary resources that we have available, and you can look at any of these to help with the information that I have provided today. And I really thank you for your attention.
Leslie, thank you so much. That was a terrific presentation full of information. Thank you to everyone here who joined us. The link to this program will be on YouTube. It's in chat. If anyone here would like to share that with others, have a great rest of your day, and thank you for joining this program.